Hey there. Tonight, we are sitting with a piece of clay that should not feel so heavy, and yet it does. In a quiet museum case in Oxford, under soft light that barely reaches the edges, there rests a narrow prism covered in little wedge marks, each one pressed by a human hand so long ago that the mind almost refuses to hold the distance. Recently, when researchers compared the old king lists, excavation records, flood layers, and temple strata line by line, what emerged was not the clean break people expect. It was something stranger. 8 kings with impossible reigns, a flood that seems to split history in two, and under the cities of Sumer, no empty world waiting to begin again, but older life, older walls, older fire ash, older hands. If this kind of slow mystery is your thing, like the video and settle in with me for a while. Lower the light a little. Let your shoulders drop, just enough. We are not going to force the night open. We are only going to sit beside it and listen. The story begins with numbers so large they feel almost impolite. 241,000. 200 years of combined rule. 8 kings. 5 cities. Then a short line, dry as old dust and twice as final. The flood swept over. I have always found that line unnerving. Not because it shouts. It does not. It barely raises its voice. It simply arrives. And once it does, everything, before it starts to feel remote, ceremonial, almost drowned in advance. The object itself is known as the Weld Blundell Prism. It carries the Sumerian King List in one of its fullest surviving forms. If you were standing in front of it, you would not be overwhelmed by size. It is not some towering monument. It is modest. Pale clay, dense columns of cuneiform, the sort of object that asks you to lean closer. And when you do, it begins whispering a past so extravagant that it feels half administrative record, half fever dream. In Eridu, Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Then Alalgar for 36,000. Other kings followed in other cities. Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipper, Shorupak. The numbers climb and accumulate and settle into the mind like slow falling ash. No, the moment many people hear those reign lengths, they either rush forward with certainty or back away with laughter. But the old text deserves a slower courtesy than that. The numbers are not random. They move in the sexagesimal logic of Mesopotamia, where units mattered differently, where number itself carried ritual elegance. Scholars have long argued that the antediluvian section was shaped, expanded, or polished for political and theological reasons. That is true enough. Still, even propaganda has a memory. You do not choose 5 cities by accident and then preserve them with this much stubborn consistency unless they already mean something. And yet the really haunting thing is not even the kings. It is the gap they create. The source script you gave me leans into that gap beautifully, and it is right to do so. Once the flood passes through the text, history seems to become smaller, harder, more human. Reigns shrink. Dynasties become plausible. the world starts behaving like the one we think we know. So the imagination naturally asks, what happened in the lost ages before that? What was destroyed? What was buried? What had to begin again? That is where the night gets interesting. Because when archaeologists go down into the ground beneath the great Sumerian cities, the earth does not tell the same dramatic story the prism does. Picture the trench wall at Eridu in the hot southern light. Mud brick lines, ash streaks, compacted soil, old floors built over older floors. You can almost feel the day baking the exposed earth while someone with a brush moves gently along a seam no wider than a finger. The wind tastes faintly of grit. Far away, a bird calls once and then thinks better of it. Down in that cut through time, there is no universal silence after some world-ending flood. No clean dead layer announcing that civilization stopped and then started over like a lamp being switched back on. Instead, there is continuity. Not perfect calm, not simplicity, but continuity. That contradiction is the true hook of the whole story, at least for me. The texts remember rupture. The ground remembers development. One record says the flood swept over. Another says people kept building, rebuilding, adapting, and passing on what they knew. If you were standing there with me, looking from the museum prism to the excavation profile, I think you would feel the same little shiver. Because both records are ancient. Both are serious. And they do not speak in exactly the same tone. The source transcript makes this tension the center of everything, and wisely so. It is not merely asking whether a flood happened. Floods happened all the time in Mesopotamia. Rivers do not need help becoming troublesome. The deeper question is what the Sumerians believed about the age before history, and what archaeology can actually show us about the long millennia between the end of the Ice Age and the rise of the first true cities. I love this part because it turns the whole matter from spectacle into patience. Instead of one giant answer crashing down from the heavens, we get layers. Versions of the King List survive in fragments, around 25 of them, copied in different times, with different omissions and emphases. Some leave out the antediluvian section altogether. Others vary in names and numbers. That detail matters. It tells us this was not a perfect frozen archive carried unchanged from some unimaginably ancient vault. It was a living tradition. Scribes handled it. Dynasties leaned on it. Theology breathed through it. Even old clay can be political. Still, living tradition does not mean empty invention. Sometimes it means the opposite. It means a memory important enough to keep reshaping because nobody wanted to lose its force. The antediluvian kings were not just decorative giants placed at the beginning for fun. They marked a world qualitatively different from the one after the flood. Longer lived, closer to divine action, less bounded by ordinary human scale. In that sense, the King List is doing what many ancient traditions do. It is not trying to give us a newspaper. It is giving us atmosphere, rank, sacred distance, and the feeling that humanity once lived under a heavier sky. There is another shadow moving through these old lists, and it is one I find impossible to ignore. The seventh figure, and Metallurgy of Sipar, a ruler later associated with being taken up to heaven and instructed in sacred secrets, especially divination. When you place him beside Enoch, seventh from Adam, who walked with God and was taken, the resemblance feels almost too neat. Not identical, but close in precisely the right places. Ancient traditions often borrow in messy ways, but sometimes the borrowing is graceful. A figure steps from one cultural room into another and changes clothes without changing posture. That seems to be what happened here. So already, before we even touch the flood story itself, we are in a world of deep shared memory. Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, threads moving through the ancient Near East like water through reeds. Nothing in isolation. Everything carrying traces of prior telling. And then the flood arrives. Not yet in the dirt, not yet in the trench, but in the texts where it first learned to become immortal. Zuzudra in the Sumerian version, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Later, much later, Noah in the Hebrew tradition. The names change. The architecture of the tale remains astonishingly stable. A divine decision. A warning. Aveshel. Survival. Sacrifice after water. A remade world. There is something almost sleepy in the repetition of that pattern across centuries. Not sleepy in a dull sense. Sleepy in the way waves repeat against a dark shore until they start to feel like memory itself. The flood hero hears. He prepares. Water rises. The many are erased. The few endure. Then, afterward, the world is measured again, but tonight, and this is where the source you gave me is strongest. We are not going to let the story become too comfortable. Because myth has one kind of truth, and soil has another. The prism sits under glass and says one thing. The buried temples of Eridu and the long prehistory of Mesopotamia murmur something else. And somewhere between those two voices, in the museum hush and the dust of the trench, sits the real question. What if the missing 6,000 years were never missing at all? What if they were simply quiet, long, cumulative, and so gradual that ancient memory turned them into a flood-divided dream because no other framework felt large enough? Honestly, that possibility feels more eerie to me than the neat version. A single disaster is easy for the mind to dramatize. A civilization growing slowly through thousands of forgotten seasons. That is harder. It asks more of us. It asks patience. It asks humility. It asks us to look at a clay prism and admit that even when our ancestors were wrong in detail, they were often right about scale. The world before cities really was different. The trouble is that it changed not in one thunderclap, but in a patient accumulation of hands, fires, seeds, walls, canals, shrines, and remembered fear. So let us stay with the prism just a little longer before we move on. Imagine the scribe who copied the old names. The clay is still damp enough to yield. The room smells faintly of earth and oil. Somewhere outside, sandals move across a courtyard. He presses the signs one after another, not knowing that thousands of years later, people will stare at the lines he made and wonder whether they describe history, theology, political theater, or some braided thing that is all three at once. He writes the names. He writes the rains. He writes the flood. Maybe he believes every word in the most literal sense. Maybe he does not. Maybe that distinction would have seemed odd to him. What matters is that the text preserves a memory of deep age and a break that changes the terms of life. There is one more detail worth keeping close before we drift onward. The cities themselves: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Uruk, Sippar, Shuruppak. Their names do not feel invented in the way pure fantasy usually does. They feel placed, weighted, like stones set carefully in a line. Even now, spoken softly in a dark room, they carry geography in them. A person could build a world out of names like that. A scribe could anchor a vanished age to them. And perhaps that is exactly what happened. A long human past, half remembered, half sacralized, tied to real places until memory and land became impossible to separate. Now we leave the museum and go toward the flood stories themselves. Because before the ground can answer, the old voices must be heard properly. Ziusudra waits in the reeds. Atrahasis listens at the wall. Utnapishtim sits at the far edge of the world with a memory like dark water. And somewhere behind all of them stands the same old fear, that the waters can rise, that order can vanish, and that what comes after must somehow begin again. The flood stories do not begin as one story. They begin as a family of stories, each one carrying the same dark shape, each one adjusting the details the way water adjusts to a new bank. In one telling, the survivor is Ziusudra. In another, he is Atrahasis. In another, Utnapishtim. Much later, in another sacred language and another covenant world, he becomes Noah. But before we start smoothing them together too quickly, it helps to sit with each voice and hear how old the pattern really is. Imagine a tablet from Nippur, broken, incomplete, still somehow full of weather. The clay is chipped along the edges. Whole clauses are missing. But enough remains to let the room darken around us. The divine assembly has decided something terrible. Humanity will be cut down by water. Not because the river wandered casually beyond its banks, but because the gods, in that stern, old Mesopotamian way, have reached a decision from which ordinary people are excluded. Only one figure, warned in time, may preserve a future. That is the pulse of the Sumerian flood myth. What I find striking is how calm the story sounds, even when its scale is enormous. Ancient Mesopotamian narrative has a way of making catastrophe feel administrative. A decision is made. Instructions are given. A vessel is built. The sky opens. The waters rise. There is almost no screaming in the text, at least not in the way modern stories would insist on it. The fear is colder than that. It arrives as procedure. Honestly, that makes it worse. Ziusudra receives warning through the god who favors cunning continuity over total destruction. In later versions, that role belongs to Enki, the deep-minded one, the god who is repeatedly associated with wisdom. Water, and the quiet art of not letting everything be lost. I have always liked him for that. Not because he is sentimental. He is not. He simply seems to understand that once a world is erased completely, no one is left to praise the victory. Then comes Atrahasis, the Akkadian form of the same deep memory. Here the flood belongs to a larger problem. Humans have multiplied. They are noisy. They are burdensome. The divine order, as the gods imagine it, has become strained. There is something grimly intimate about that. Humanity is not destroyed because it has become abstractly evil in the later moralized sense. It becomes too much, too loud, too present. A management problem on a cosmic scale. The flood in this version feels less like rage and more like a terrible correction. And yet even here, warning slips through the cracks. A wall listens. A man hears what he should not have heard directly. Instructions pass in a form half concealed and half merciful. Build, prepare, preserve. In stories like this, survival is never just luck. It is a transfer of pattern. Carry the living seed of order into the vessel. Carry what can begin again. By the time we reach Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood has become both memory and distance. Gilgamesh is no flood hero. He is the latecomer, the exhausted king who comes searching for a way past death and finds instead an old man who survived the greatest break in the world. I love the sadness of that scene. Gilgamesh arrives wanting a secret. What he receives is a story, a very ancient story. You go looking for immortality, and an old survivor tells you about weather. Still, what weather? The dimensions of the boat, the gathering storm, the release of birds, the mountain resting place, the sacrifice afterward. When the Hebrew tradition eventually gives us Noah, so much of the structure is already old, not borrowed carelessly, not copied without transformation, but carried through centuries of retelling in the ancient Near East, where stories moved like caravans and settled in new theological cities. That matters for our question tonight, because once the flood story itself is placed in its broader setting, it stops looking like a lone historical report and starts looking like a durable mythic container. It can hold memory of local disaster. It can hold theological fear. It can hold reflections on kingship, survival, divine justice, and the fragility of order. And because it can hold all that, it grows. This is where archaeology enters with its patient, almost impolite refusal to be impressed by literary grandeur alone. The source transcript handled this beautifully through Woolley at and I want to stay with that scene for a while. Leonard Woolley was a gifted excavator, and also, like many excavators of his age, not entirely immune to the thrill of finding something the whole world already wanted him to find. Under the city of he encountered a thick layer of sterile clay. At first glance, it looked dramatic enough to anchor a great deluge. A clean flood event. A dividing line. Public imagination leapt immediately. You can understand why. A trench wall is a very persuasive thing when it seems to tell a simple story. Above, a city. Below, a washed layer. Somewhere in the middle, silence. The mind rushes to complete the pattern. Here, surely, the waters came. But the ground rarely rewards first impressions for long. Later analysis softened the grand certainty. The deposit at Ur did not behave like one universal flood horizon that erased all civilization in a single convulsion. It looked more like repeated water-laid sediment interwoven with occupation across centuries. Severe flooding, yes. Devastating at moments, yes. Apocalyptic for those caught in it, certainly. But not the end of civilization, and not the restart of history. That distinction matters more than it first seems to. Local catastrophe can still become universal memory. If your town is broken by water, if the houses are gone, if bodies disappear, if the fields turn to slick gray ruin, then the phrase, "the whole world was destroyed," is not exaggeration in the emotional sense. It is simply how humans remember the scale of what they have suffered. We do not narrate grief by topographic accuracy. And Ur is not alone. Kish shows flood evidence, but not in a neat, single, synchronized way. Shuruppak, the very city associated with the flood hero, has a flood deposit around the right rough period to feed later tradition. Eridu, so crucial in the King List, does not offer the same corresponding flood layer. If one universal civilizational deluge had swept southern Mesopotamia in a single act, the archaeological record ought to show something more unified. Instead, it shows a river world doing what river worlds do. Flooding violently, unevenly, repeatedly, and locally enough to scar memory without resetting all development. There is something darkly human in that too. We want one giant event because it feels narratively satisfying. The earth keeps offering us clusters instead. Several bad years. Several terrible floods. One city struck hard. Another spared. A hero story condensing generations of river fear into one perfect vessel. Myth is elegant. Hydrology is messy. From there, the source script widened, as it should, toward the Black Sea, sea level rise, and the end of the Ice Age. We should go there slowly now. Not because those theories solve everything. They do not. But because they remind us that human flood memory may extend beyond Mesopotamia without needing a single global drowning. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis once felt almost too cinematic to resist. A freshwater basin cut off from the Mediterranean. Rising seas after the Ice Age. Then breach, torrent, collapse. Water roaring through with immense force. Enough to seed a legend. The idea has captivated scholars and the public alike for good reason. It gives you scale. It gives you a before and after. It gives you frightened communities watching shorelines vanish and carrying the memory inland. But science, when it is behaving properly, likes to cool the room down after a dramatic entrance. Later studies question the size, speed, and catastrophic nature of that flood scenario. Some evidence suggests more modest change. Some even reverses the direction of flow. The grand version becomes less secure, and yet the broader truth remains. At the end of the last ice age, waters rose across the world. Coasts drowned. Plains disappeared. The Persian Gulf filled. Beringia vanished. Human communities everywhere would have watched the edges of their world change in ways large enough to become ancestral sorrow. Then comes the younger Dryas, and the whole mood shifts again. Warmth had begun to return after the last glacial severity. Ice withdrew. Landscapes opened. Then, abruptly, in climatological terms, cold came back. Not for a season, but for long enough to break assumptions. Temperatures dropped. Conditions turned harsh. Human communities that had begun adjusting to one world found themselves dragged backward toward another. This is not a flood story in the narrow sense, but it is absolutely a catastrophe story. One of those deep environmental events that can leave marks in both land and imagination. What is not really in dispute is that the world after the ice was unstable in ways later peoples could feel without understanding in scientific language. Rising waters, shifting coasts, violent local floods, sudden cold, vanishing corridors of life. Once you sit with that longer rhythm, the so-called missing 6,000 years stop looking empty. They start looking busy, fragile, and full of work. That realization changes the flood itself. Instead of one absolute break between a dead old world and a living new one, we begin to glimpse a chain of environmental shocks and human responses, compressed by myth into a single overwhelming sentence. The flood swept over. Ancient memory loves compression. It has to. No culture can sing every season individually for 6,000 years. Eventually, the details gather into one large symbolic weather, and perhaps that is why the old stories have endured. Not because they are precise in our preferred way, but because they are emotionally accurate. Human beings really did live through rising waters, climatic reversals, drowned landscapes, and local destructions strong enough to feel universal. Their descendants, long after the worst of those events had passed, told stories in which one man listened, one vessel floated, one mountain held, and one offering rose after the waters drew back. In that form, the unbearable became tellable. I have always found the offering after the flood one of the saddest details. Not because of the ritual itself, but because it means someone had to step onto wet ground and begin again while the world still smelled of mud and loss. Fire lit again. Hands shaking, perhaps, though the texts are too formal to say so. The first smoke rising into a washed sky. Civilization is often described through its monuments, but I suspect it begins more quietly than that, with the first small act that says we are still here. So as this part settles, let the waters remain in the room, but let them change shape. They are not only the mythic flood now. They are river floods in Mesopotamia. Post-glacial seas climbing old coastlines. Meltwater surges. Climate instability. Repeated human fear. And they are also memory itself, smoothing sharp events into one dark, shining narrative. In the next stretch of the story, we leave the disaster behind just enough to ask a more difficult question. If the flood did not wipe civilization clean, then what filled those long millennia? Who planted? Who built? Who raised stone before cities? who learned the first patient arts that made Sumer possible. Once the flood begins to loosen its grip on the imagination, something even stranger comes into view. There was no empty pause before Sumer. No blank stage waiting for cities to step into the light. There were thousands of years of people doing the quiet work that history books often neglect because it does not fit inside one dramatic sentence. They watched weather. They cut grain. They buried their dead beneath house floors. They learned which seeds returned and which failed. They moved camp less often, then less often still. They built walls that were not yet cities, and shrines that were not yet temple states. The missing years were not missing at all. They were simply patient. I think that is one of the hardest truths for modern minds to love. We enjoy pivots. We like doors slamming open. We like to believe civilization burst into being like a torch lifted in a dark room. But most human greatness enters more quietly. It arrives through repetition, through habits so ordinary they almost disappear while they are happening. A hand selecting the larger grain heads. Another hand grinding seed into meal. Someone repairing a fence line before dawn because the animals have begun testing its weakness. These acts do not sound like history. They sound like chores. Yet enough of them, carried across enough generations, become the foundation of worlds. When the younger Dryas cold settled over the northern hemisphere, communities that had already begun experimenting with more settled forms of life found themselves under pressure. Wild resources became less predictable. Seasonal abundance narrowed. In the Levant and surrounding regions, the old balance between gathering, hunting, and the first hesitant plant management began to change. Not because anyone announced the birth of agriculture, but because conditions made old strategies harder and new ones more attractive. That is the thing about turning points. People inside them rarely know they are living through one. They are simply trying to make it through another lean season. The Natufians are often brought into this conversation, and rightly so. They lived before pottery, before full-scale farming, before the great cities. Yet they were already doing something remarkable. They were settling more firmly into place. They built stone-lined structures. They harvested wild cereals. They stored food. They developed mortars and sickle blades polished by repeated cutting of grain stalks. If you stand in imagination beside one of their settlements, you do not see Sumer yet. But you do see a mind learning to bind itself more tightly to landscape. Picture an early morning on a hillside village. The air is cold enough to sharpen the breath, but the sun has begun to edge the stones with pale warmth. Someone kneels near a patch of grasses, fingers moving carefully through the stalks, choosing what to cut and what to leave. Nearby, another person checks a storage pit. Children carry small loads. A dog notices everything and contributes very little except suspicion. The scene is not grand. That is exactly why it matters. Civilization is beginning in places like this, through attention. Sites such as Abu Huraira preserve this transition with extraordinary poignancy. There, archaeologists found evidence for foraging communities shifting gradually toward cultivation. The botanical remains record-changing relationships to rye and later other cereals. Even bones and teeth preserve the story. Bodies wear the labor of grinding grain. Hands and backs pay for stability. The price of food security is not romance. It is effort repeated until it becomes custom. And then there are the plants themselves, silent collaborators in this long transformation. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas. They did not leap fully domesticated into human hands. They were drawn, slowly, into a new compact. Humans selected the ears that held together rather than shattering and spilling their seeds too early. They favored larger grains, predictable growth, plants that could be harvested, stored, and sown again with better odds of success. In return, those plants spread beyond what wild distribution alone might have granted them. Domestication was not a single invention. It was a relationship deepening until neither side could return fully to what it had been before. Animal domestication followed its own winding road. Goats and sheep came first in many regions because they suited the new balance of movement and control. They could be managed, bred, culled, milked, and eventually folded into ritual and status as well as diet. Pigs and cattle entered different ecological and social niches. No one morning began with a declaration that humanity had now mastered livestock. Instead, there were pens, losses, escapes, births watched more closely than before, temperaments noted, and pathways between settlement and pasture, worn deeper by years of use. I have always found the emotional side of this transition strangely moving. To domesticate a plant or animal is to bet on the future in a more serious way than foraging requires. You store seed because you believe there will be another season worth sowing. You keep breeding stock because you expect continuity. You build bins, enclosures, and houses because you think staying may finally be wiser than leaving. Agriculture is not just a food system. It is a philosophy of tomorrow. That philosophy changed everything. Once food could be stored more reliably, population could grow. Once population grew, settlement patterns thickened. Once settlements thickened, labor could be divided in new ways. Not everyone needed to range outward every day. Some could shape stone. Some could tend ritual. Some could make baskets, plaster walls, watch children, herd animals, repair roofs, or stand guard. Specialization did not arrive all at once, but its roots sank into the ground early. Surplus is a quiet tyrant. It creates possibility, and then it demands management. That is why the 6,000 years before Sumer are so full. They are full of social experimentation. Who owns stored grain? Who distributes it? Who settles disputes when families live this close together? Who remembers seasonal timing? Who controls access to ritual places? Who speaks for the dead? And who decides where the living will build next? Every one of those questions had to be lived through before the first city could ever think of itself as natural. There is also a sensory truth that the archaeological record keeps whispering. These early settled worlds were dense with texture. Plaster under the hand, drying and cracking in heat. Smoke rising from hearths inside low-roofed rooms. Grain dust caught in hair. Mud tracked across thresholds. Water carried in jars heavy enough to mark the hips and shoulders of those who moved it. The smell of animals close by. The strange comfort and irritation of neighbors being always near. It was not paradise. It was concentration. Some of the earliest substantial buildings in the Near East already reveal that people were thinking beyond immediate survival. Shared storage, community structures, spaces distinguished from domestic rooms. Even before large-scale urban life, humans were separating the ordinary from the special. They were drawing symbolic lines through space. Here we sleep. Here we keep grain. Here we bury the dead. Here we gather for something larger than eating. Once that mental architecture exists, monumental architecture becomes only a matter of scale and coordination. And coordination is the hidden engine of the whole story. To plant and harvest together, to manage animals, to store food, to defend territory, to maintain pathways and water access, to time activity with seasons. These all require trust, memory, and systems. Not yet bureaucracy in the Sumerian sense, but certainly proto-administration. Somebody knows where the grain is. Somebody knows how much there was last year. Somebody notices who is not pulling their weight, and somebody else decides whether that matters. By the time we get deeper into the pre-pottery Neolithic, the old image of scattered primitive bands begins to fail completely. There are settled communities with architecture, ritual practice, selective cultivation, animal management, symbolic traditions, and continuity over generations. The work is slow, but it is cumulative. A floor laid by one generation becomes the subfloor of another. A burial beneath a house anchors the living to place. A storage method that works is copied. One village learns from another. Trade in obsidian and other materials links regions long before cities. Knowledge spreads, not with trumpets, but with feet. Honestly, I think that is what makes this stretch of human time so powerful. It does not need a great lost empire to be astonishing. It only needs to be seen properly. For thousands of years, people were teaching themselves how to live in larger and more interdependent forms without any guarantee the experiment would hold. They were inventing the emotional discipline of civilization long before they invented writing to describe it. That is why the flood line on the prism now feels different. Once you understand the scale of the long Neolithic transformation, the old text no longer reads like a literal interruption of an already complete civilization. It reads like mythic compression laid over a much longer developmental truth. Ancient scribes looked backward and saw deep time, strange kings, and a dividing flood. Archaeology looks backward and sees centuries of adaptation, partial collapse, recovery, and innovation. Both are ways of remembering the distance between the settled present and the shadowy age before it. As the cold loosened and climate stabilized more fully in the early Holocene, the possibilities widened. Communities spread. Cultivation deepened. Herding intensified. Storage became more substantial. Houses improved. Symbolic life became richer, not poorer. This last point matters a great deal. People did not first solve subsistence and only then think about gods, ancestors, and cosmic order. They did both together. Sometimes ritual may even have helped make settlement possible by binding groups through shared obligation and spectacle. That thought leads us directly toward one of the most astonishing sites ever uncovered. A place that overturned the old sequence many scholars had comfortably believed. A place of pillars, carved beasts, feasting, burial, and deliberate architectural force. A place older than pottery, older than cities, older than the first true states, and yet already full of coordinated, symbolic ambition. Göbekli Tepe waits there like a hand raised in the dark, reminding us that organized human meaning came before the things we once thought it depended on. Before we leave this long pre-urban world, I want to linger over one more image. A village at dusk after harvest. The grinding stones have gone quiet, one by one. Smoke hangs low. Someone checks a basket of seed, not for tonight's meal, but for next year's planting. That single gesture contains the whole future. Keep some back. Do not eat it all. Trust the season not yet seen. Civilization begins there, in restraint as much as abundance. And once people learn that kind of restraint together, they are already very far from the world. The flood myths imagine as simple beginning. Göbekli Tepe has a way of rearranging the furniture inside the mind. Even now, years after the first shock of its excavation, the site still feels like an argument held in stone. For a long time, many scholars assumed a neat order. First came farming, then villages thickened, then surplus allowed hierarchy, ritual specialization, and eventually monumental building. It was a pleasant sequence, clean and reassuring in the way many textbook sequences are. Then Göbekli Tepe rose from the southeastern Anatolian earth and behaved very badly. The site sits on a limestone ridge, high enough that wind must always have had some authority there. If you imagine approaching it in the early morning, the ground is pale and rough underfoot. The horizon opens wide. There is no city around it. No denser urban life. No state apparatus that we can clearly see in the later Mesopotamian sense. And yet buried within the mound were circular enclosures built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing many tons, set upright with astonishing care. On their surfaces appear foxes, snakes, birds, boars, scorpion, wild creatures rendered with a sharpness that still feels alert, as if they might slide back into motion when no one is looking. What does one do with a place like that? I mean, emotionally, not just academically, because it should not be there according to the old story. Or rather, it should not be there so early, so organized, so symbolically concentrated. It belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic, before the settled agricultural package had fully matured in the form once thought necessary for such ambition. And that means people gathered, carved, hauled, erected, and enclosed these stones before the first true cities, before writing, before ceramics became ordinary domestic companions. The implications are enormous and also wonderfully awkward. Some researchers now think ritual concentration may have helped drive, rather than merely follow, economic change. A community that gathers seasonally at a charged ceremonial site needs food, lavor, planning, and social bonds strong enough to coordinate repeated effort. Feasting follows. Transport follows. Territorial memory follows. A sacred center might intensify the very habits that later become settlement and agriculture. In other words, people may have built meaning first, then reorganized life around the need to sustain it. If that sounds too elegant, Göbekli Tepe helps keep it grounded. The site was not some heavenly vision descending complete from nowhere. It was built by bodies. Bodies that cut limestone with stone tools. Bodies that hauled blocks, dressed surfaces, arranged enclosures, and likely prepared food for large gatherings. Bodies that knew seasons, routes, obligation, and the subtle politics of getting enough people to work toward one purpose without killing each other halfway through. Monumentality does not abolish human friction. It simply proves a community learned how to survive it long enough to raise stone. I find myself thinking about the hands most of all. A carver leaning in close to the pillar face, following the curve of an animal's spine. Dust coating forearms. Heat gathering on the back of the neck. The little repeated tap and scrape of tool against limestone. Nearby, another group wrestles a pillar base into alignment. Motering, adjusting, breathing hard. Somewhere food is being prepared. Somewhere children are being told not to wander too near the work. No one there knows they are becoming one of the great puzzles of future archaeology. They are simply doing what the place requires. Then there is the burial of the enclosures. This is one of the eeriest facts about Göbekli Tepe. The great circles were not merely abandoned to weather. Many were deliberately backfilled. Stone, rubble, debris, animal bone, tools, all used to seal the spaces. The site was put to sleep by human choice. That deliberate closure gives the whole hill a funerary dignity. It is not a failed settlement. It is a sequence of sacred rooms made, used, and then hidden. Why? We cannot say with full confidence. Changing ritual forms, social reorganization, shifting populations, new needs. The reasons remain debated, but the act itself matters. People valued these spaces enough, not merely to walk away from them, but to bury them. That burial feels oddly close to the flood stories we have been circling. Not because Göbekli Tepe proves any particular deluge, but because it reminds us that early human communities were already capable of thinking in terms of sacred before and after. Build, consecrate, use, cover, remember differently. Deep time has many ways of drowning a place, and not all of them involve water. If Göbekli Tepe represents concentrated ritual without later urban form, Catalhoyuk offers a different experiment entirely. Move forward several millennia and westward into central Anatolia, and the atmosphere changes. No giant carved pillars rising from circular sanctuaries. Instead, a dense settlement of mud brick houses packed side by side so tightly that there are effectively no streets at ground level. People moved across rooftops. Entry was through openings above. Ladders descended into rooms where daily life, burial, cooking, craft, and memory all pressed close together. Catalhoyuk is one of those places that makes you rethink what a settlement can feel like. Imagine standing on that roofscape at dawn. Flat surfaces in every direction, smoke lifting from openings, Footsteps, soft on packed plaster, the smell of ash, dung fuel, cooking grain, and damp earth all mingling in air that has not yet fully warmed. Beneath your feet, each house is not only a home, it is an archive. Burials lie beneath floors. Walls hold paintings. Platforms carry domestic and perhaps ritual significance. Horns are installed. Plaster is renewed again and again until the surfaces themselves feel layered with habit. This is not a city in the later Mesopotamian sense. There are no obvious palaces, no formal temples dominating the settlement, no clear evidence of kings striding about in self-satisfaction. Yet it is also far beyond any image of simple village life. It is dense, long-lived, symbolically rich, and socially intricate. People lived very close together, and that closeness changed everything. Privacy, movement, labor, conflict, memory, and ritual all had to be negotiated in compressed space. One of the most moving features of Çatalhöyük is the burial of the dead within houses. The ancestors did not leave the domestic world. They remained below the feet of the living, under platforms where people slept, worked, ate, and told stories. Some skulls were later removed and plastered. Memory in such a place was not abstract. It was architectural. The house did not merely shelter the family. It held their continuity. Once you have lived in that kind of layered presence for generations, the idea of place becomes almost sacred by default. There are wall paintings too. Geometric forms, hunting scenes, perhaps maps, perhaps not. Interpretations have shifted over time, as they should. Archaeology is better when it stays a little nervous around certainty. But whatever each image finally means, the broader truth is undeniable. Catalhoyuk was saturated with symbolism. The people there were not waiting for civilization to teach them how to think about death, wild animals, ancestry, and cosmic order. They were already deep inside those questions. That point matters because it demolishes another old simplification. Human beings did not first solve subsistence and only then develop religion, art, and symbolic complexity as luxuries. The evidence suggests they were braided together from the start. Ritual and representation are not decorations attached to settled life. They are part of the machinery that makes settled life bearable and meaningful. Honestly, when I think about Catalhoyuk for too long, I begin to feel a strange tenderness for the difficulty of living there. Roof-to-roof movement. Constant maintenance of plaster. Smoke-staining interiors. Burials below. Neighbors everywhere. Children growing up in houses that had held grandparents in death as well as life. It would have been intimate, exhausting, noisy, comforting, and occasionally impossible. In other words, it would have been very human. And that humanity is exactly what connects Göbekli Tepe and Catalhoyuk to the larger argument of our story. Neither site fits the idea of an empty prehistory waiting for Sumer to arrive as the first true act of civilization. Instead, they reveal long centuries of experimentation in monumentality, domestic density, ritual symbolism, coordination, and social memory. The road to Sumer was not blank. It was crowded with earlier attempts to bind people, place and meaning together. You can see the continuity if you soften your gaze a little. At Gobekli Tepe, groups gather around a charged sacred center and coordinate labor at striking scale. At Catalhoyuk, settlement density, ritualized domestic life, and ancestral continuity deepen the social fabric. Later in Mesopotamia, temple rise, administrative households expand, irrigation demands cooperation, and writing eventually enters to stabilize increasingly complex flows of goods and obligations. The forms change. The underlying challenge remains. How do humans organize themselves at scale without losing the patterns that hold them together? The answer, it seems, took thousands of years of trial. Sacred architecture before cities, dense households before states, ancestor-rich rooms before archives, monumental gathering before monarchy. When seen this way, the so-called missing millennia are no longer missing at all. They become full of prototypes. And prototypes are often more unsettling than finished systems, because they reveal uncertainty. Göbekli Tepe does not know where history is heading. Çatalhöyük does not either. They are not preliminary drafts of Sumer in any simplistic way. They are alternative solutions, local intensities, experiments in being human together. Some paths stop, some transform, some feed later worlds indirectly. What matters is that complexity was already alive. That is why, when we finally descend south toward the marshes of Mesopotamia and the Ubaid world, we do not arrive at a miraculous beginning. We arrive at another stage in a very long continuum, where irrigation, pottery, temple sites, and settled sacred geography begin to gather into the direct ancestors of Sumer. Göbekli Tepe and Catalhoyuk have done their work by then. They have broken the old illusion that civilization came late and suddenly. They have made room for a slower, darker, more beautiful story, one in which human beings spent millennia learning how to build not only shelter, but significance. Before we leave these two sites, hold one final contrast in mind. At Gobekli Tepe, the sacred seems to stand apart, lifted and enclosed. At Catalhoyuk, the sacred seeps through domestic life itself, into walls, floors, burials, and daily movement. Between those two experiments lies a vast lesson. Early humanity was not trying one path towards civilization, but many. Some built circles for gathering. Some built roof worlds for living close above their dead. Later, Mesopotamia would inherit the same old burden in a new form: how to turn concentration into order without letting memory disappear. From the roof world of Catalhoyuk and the stone silence of Göbekli Tepe, the story bends south and east toward the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, where two rivers spent ages making and unmaking the land. This is where the next great patience begins. Not yet Sumer in its full written confidence, not yet kings carving their names into memory, but the long Ubaid world, green at the edges, muddy at the center, full of reeds, fish, marsh birds, low houses, painted pottery, and the first unmistakable signs that southern Mesopotamia was learning how to become a civilizational engine. If you were to approach that landscape in the 6th or 5th millennium before our era, you would not see monumental walls rising from the horizon. You would see water moving in ways that demanded respect, channels shifting, marshes opening and closing with season and flood, flat land so broad that the sky would feel almost oversized, as if it had not yet learned where to stop. The light there must have been severe in summer, white and heavy by midday, then surprisingly tender in the morning when the reeds held a little coolness and birds crossed low over still water. The south was rich, but only on terms. Rich in mud, rich in fish, rich in rates, rich in the possibility of cultivation if people could persuade water to arrive where and when it was needed. That if matters. Southern Mesopotamia did not yield stable abundance by kindness. It yielded it by management. The people who settled there had to become students of gradient, moisture, embankment, channeling, and timing. In a way, the first true teachers of Sumer were not kings or gods, but canals. That is one reason the Ubaid period matters so much. It does not dazzle the imagination in the way later ziggurats or royal burials do, but it is the age when the South begins to acquire habits that later city life will depend on. Settlements expand. Pottery traditions stabilize. Temple sites take shape. Irrigation becomes not just a trick or local solution, but a structuring principle of life. The old scattered possibilities begin folding into a recognizably durable pattern. Tel el-Owali is one of those sites that quietly changes the scale of the whole story. Excavations there push the southern Mesopotamian sequence earlier and deeper than scholars once imagined. Suddenly, the South was not waiting for later brilliance to awaken it. It already held substantial settlement, architecture, storage, and organized life in periods far older than classical Sumer. I always find that kind of discovery deeply satisfying. Every time the ground produces another early level, another wall line, another floor, another domestic cluster, it gently embarrasses the tidy old idea that civilization just appeared when the textbooks finally noticed it. And then there is Eridu. Ancient Eridu has a special gravity in this whole narrative, partly because the texts later remembered it as the first city, the first seat of kingship, the place where something foundational began, and partly because archaeology gives it a depth that justifies at least some of that reverence. The earliest temple levels at Eridu go back far into the Ubaid horizon. Layer after layer, shrine after shrine, rebuilt on the same sacred spot. A small temple becomes a larger one, then another, each phase preserving alignment and purpose even as the structure changes. Imagine that place over centuries. The same patch of ground, chosen, cleared, marked, built upon, repaired, raised again. Mud brick drying in heat, fish bones and ash from offerings, reed mats, plastered surfaces, the smell of wet earth after canal work, a priest or attendant stepping lightly across a threshold that his grandparents knew in a smaller form, and their grandparents before them in smaller still. That is how sanctity accumulates, not by declaration alone, but by repetition so faithful that place begins to feel heavier than the people moving through it. The source transcript was right to emphasize continuity here. At Eridu, we do not find a world shattered cleanly by one flood and restarted from zero. We find persistence, sacred persistence, architectural persistence, human persistence. The old story of kingship descending from heaven into Eridu may be theological, but it speaks to something real all the same. Eridu was early, deeply early, and it stayed important because people kept making it important across generations that had every practical reason to move elsewhere if meaning had not held them there. The pottery of the Ubaid world tells its own version of that persistence. Fine painted ceramics appear across a remarkably wide area, suggesting not a single empire, but a broad cultural koine, a shared horizon of style and practice extending across much of Mesopotamia and beyond. Bowls, jars, serving vessels, storage forms, each one carrying the touch of standardization. This is not the glamour of gold. It is something better. Repetition, shared expectation, the comforting social power of knowing what a vessel is for and how it should look. Trade widens through that same horizon. Obsidian, stone, shell, and other materials move. Boats likely slip through river and marsh channels, carrying both goods and habits. There is a temptation to imagine early exchange as rough and improvised. But the archaeological record keeps suggesting more composure than that. Networks existed. People knew where desirable materials came from. They knew how to move them. They knew who could be trusted, at least enough to keep sending things back and forth. Long before writing, memory was already logistical. And logistics, quietly enough, is one of the great themes of civilization. Not glory, not conquest. Getting things where they need to be. Grain to storage, water to fields, labor to embankments, pots to households, offerings to shrines, stone from one region to another. A settled world becomes increasingly dependent on choreography. If you want a dark thought to whisper before sleep, it is this: that the difference between a village and a city may begin as a difference in how much coordinated inconvenience people can endure. The houses of the Ubaid world are revealing too. Tripartite layouts appear, with central halls and side rooms, suggesting a new confidence in domestic organization and perhaps social differentiation as well. Some structures are clearly more than ordinary homes. Others blur the line between residence, storage, and sacred function. That blur is important. In early Mesopotamia, the temple economy did not drop down into human life from nowhere. It grew out of older patterns in which storage, ritual, lavor, and authority were already becoming entangled. I think that entanglement is one of the real engines of everything that follows. Once a settlement needs coordination for irrigation, storage for surplus, and sacred centers for legitimacy, certain households or institutions begin to matter more than others. Somebody knows the canal schedule. Somebody measures grain. Somebody manages offerings. Somebody allocates labor for repair after flood damage. The people who stand closest to these tasks do not just gain information. They gain position. Social inequality does not need a villain to begin. Sometimes it begins in competence and does not stop there. That is one reason temples matter so early. They are not simply houses for gods in the later monumental sense. They are nodal points, places where material life and cosmic explanation meet. If the canal works, a god has been honored correctly. If the fish are abundant, a god has remained favorable. If the flood is restrained, order holds. If the harvest fails, perhaps some ritual, social, or ecological line has been broken. Temple and field are not separate worlds. They are one conversation in different forms. And so the south deepens. The marsh becomes patterned by embankment. Settlements become linked. Sacred places become layered. Pottery styles spread. Labor routines settle into expectation. People are still living close to mud, close to water, close to the fragility of everything. But now they are doing so inside systems that endure longer than any one household. The mind of the region is changing. You can feel the approach of Uruk from here, even before it arrives. Not because a prophet announces it, but because all the prerequisites are thickening. Surplus, coordination, specialized craft, sacred authority, long-distance exchange, the habit of rebuilding on the same site, the willingness to let institutions outlive persons. Once those habits mature enough, the city in the strong sense becomes possible. Still, I do not want to rush there too quickly, because the Ubaid world deserves its own dignity. It is easy to treat it as a mere preface, but prefaces can last for millennia, and this one was written in canal mud and temple ash. The people of the Ubaid horizon were not waiting for history to begin. They were already making it, only in a register less noisy than the one that came later. Imagine evening at Eridu during one of those early temple phases. Water insects skimming the edge of a channel. Mud brick walls still warm from the day. A faint smell of fish and hearth smoke. Someone carrying a bowl to the shrine. Someone else scraping clay from a tool before tomorrow's work. In the distance, a child calling, then laughter, then quiet. Nothing here looks like empire. And yet the future of cities is already breathing. This is why the old prism line about kingship descending into Eridu has never completely lost its power, even if taken symbolically. Because something did descend there, if not in the literal way the text imagines. Order descended. Permanence descended. The idea that one place could gather sacred and practical authority together and hold it long enough to shape a region that descended. The city was not born in an instant, but the conviction that cities mattered in a cosmic way that may indeed have first settled there like light lowering onto still water. There is humor in that too, if you let yourself notice it. The first great hydraulic societies are built by people endlessly worrying about mud, not gold, not philosophy. Mud in the wrong place. Mud in the canal. Mud cracking in the wall. Mud drying too fast or too slowly. Civilization sounds grand until you follow it back far enough and realize that for long stretches it is simply a long argument with earth and water. Yet from those arguments came confidence. Shared labor meant schedules. Schedules meant memory. Memory meant authority. Authority, once attached to sacred places and storage rooms, became harder to challenge because it no longer lived only in charisma. It lived in routines, in the field that must be opened at the right hour, in the shrine that must receive its due, in the workers who know where to gather because they gathered there last season too. The city is already hiding inside those routines, curled up like a future animal waiting for enough food to grow. From Eridu, the path rises toward Uruk, and when it does, the scale changes so sharply it can almost make the earlier centuries look modest. But they were not modest. They were preparatory in the deepest sense. They taught southern Mesopotamia how to live with water, how to store value, how to layer sacred meaning on place, how to coordinate labor, how to let institutions persist. Without those slow lessons, Uruk could never have become what it did. So keep the reeds and fish bones in mind as we move forward. Keep the painted pottery. Keep the low temples rebuilt over and over. Keep the canal banks and the hand that checks them before sunrise. The first city does not rise out of nowhere. It rises from a marsh world that has been thinking for a very long time. And then, almost suddenly, if you look only at the broad timeline, but not suddenly at all if you have walked with the centuries, Uruk rises. The change in scale is difficult to overstate. What had been long preparation in the Neolithic and Ubaid worlds now begins to harden into something unmistakable. Bigger institutions, bigger populations, bigger demands on memory, bigger walls between those who manage and those who are managed. Uruk is not simply another settlement among many. It is one of the first places on Earth where human beings seem to have accepted the full burden of living in a city. If you were approaching it in the late 4th millennium before our era, you would not mistake it for a village. The horizon would begin to break differently. Large precincts, rising temple platforms, dense clusters of buildings, movement everywhere, animal noise, human noise, dust kicked upward by traffic that no single household controls anymore. The city has a sound distinct from any earlier settlement, a layered sound. Work, command, argument, prayer, transaction, repetition. A city does not merely contain more people. It contains more simultaneity. Uruk, at its height, may have held tens of thousands of inhabitants, perhaps more, depending on how one measures the inhabited sprawl and surrounding dependencies. That alone would change everything. Waste becomes a problem. Storage becomes central. Water supply and movement become strategic. Labor must be mobilized at scales that no kin group alone can manage. And once labor reaches that scale, administration ceases to be a convenience. It becomes destiny. The source transcript rightly centered the technologies and institutions that crystallize here. Standardized production, cylinder seals, numerical tablets, mass-produced beveled rim bowls, monumental temple complexes, administrative quarters, differentiated work. This is the point where one can feel the city teaching itself to count. I think those first counting systems deserve more tenderness than they usually receive. Modern people hear administration and their souls wilt a little. But in early Uruk, the rise of record-keeping is almost miraculous in its quiet practicality. Before literature, before royal inscriptions, before law codes carved for public display, there is the simple need to remember who owes what, who received how much grain, how many jars came in, how many animals were allocated, how much labor was due. Civilizational memory begins as bookkeeping, because bodies need food before epics need heroes. The pathway toward writing now looks less abrupt than it once did, and that is one of the best examples of how archaeology matures. Long before full cuneiform signs appear on tablets, people were already using tokens, bullae, impressed marks, and numerical systems to externalize information. A token stands for a quantity or category. A clay envelope encloses tokens and bears impressions on the outside. Eventually, the impressions themselves become enough. Marks can replace objects. Then marks can become more elaborate. Then the mark system deepens into proto-writing. It is such a human progression. First, carry the thing. Then, represent the thing. Then realize the representation can do more than the thing ever could. Imagine a scribe in training at Uruk. Though the word scribe may still be too grand for the earliest stages. Wet clay before him, a stylus in hand, a supervisor nearby, not cruel, perhaps, but not especially patient either. Signs repeated, quantities repeated, commodity marks repeated. Grain, sheep, oil, laboration. The first writing is not dreaming. It is keeping up, and precisely because it begins under pressure, it becomes durable. That durability changes the nature of society. Once information can survive outside the fallible bodies that hold it, institutions gain a new kind of memory. The temple can know what it stored last month. A household can be held to a prior obligation. An allocation can be compared, corrected, audited in primitive form. Authority becomes less dependent on someone remembering correctly in a room and more dependent on marks that stay behind after the room has emptied. No wonder writing has always carried a faint chill. It is memory detached from breath. Cylinder seals belong to this same emotional world. I love them because they are at once intimate and bureaucratic. A tiny carved object, warm from the pocket or the hand, rolled across wet clay to leave behind ownership, authorization, identity, legitimacy. In a city as large and layered as Uruk, the seal becomes an extension of the self and of office. The mark says, this jar, this storeroom, this transaction, this tablet passed through known hands. Trust begins to harden into image. And then there are the beveled rim bowls, those plain, rough, mass-produced vessels that appear in extraordinary numbers. They are not glamorous objects. No one would choose one over a finely painted ceremonial cup if beauty were the only criterion. But that is precisely what makes them so revealing. They speak of scale, of repetitive production, of rationing systems, of labor forces needing standardized distribution. Civilizations are often most honestly described by their ugly, useful things. The temple precincts at Uruk, especially around Eanna and Anu, also reveal a new confidence in monumental organization. Platforms rise. Facades become more elaborate. Space is choreographed to elevate some zones above others, physically and conceptually. The sacred is now inseparable from institutional grandeur. To enter such a precinct would be to enter managed awe. Walls direct movement. Height conveys authority. Surfaces announce labor already spent. The gods live here, yes, but so does administration. That pairing is one of the most important inheritances of the earlier millennia. The temple is not only where the divine is served, it is where grain is stored, labor directed, offerings measured, and legitimacy concentrated. In earlier periods, sacred place and practical coordination had already begun to intertwine. At Uruk, that intertwining becomes unmistakable and massive. The city does not separate spirit from management. It fuses them. I have always found that fusion both brilliant and slightly frightening. It means the order of the cosmos and the order of the storeroom begin sounding like one language. If the god is pleased, the grain accounts will reflect it. If the temple thrives, so does the social machine around it. This is part of what later gives Mesopotamian kingship and administration their peculiar theological depth. They do not merely govern land. They govern inside a sacred architecture of order. The source material also stressed the apparent suddenness of technological and organizational complexity around the Uruk period. And here, too, the best answer is patience. Metallurgy, irrigation, and astronomical attention all fit the same pattern. Nothing here requires a miraculous download. It requires continuity of craft, observation, exchange, and memory. The sky rewards persistence, and so do furnaces and canals. The agricultural base below all this cannot be overstated. Fields, canals, storage, herd management, transport, and labor rationing create the material floor on which every higher structure stands. If the floor fails, the city trembles. That is why so much of early Mesopotamian life feels administrative. Administration is what keeps concentration from becoming famine. A city is always one broken distribution system away from panic. Social stratification also sharpens in this period. Some houses are larger. Some precincts are more central. Some goods are more exclusive. Burial differentiation grows. Craft specialization thickens. The world of broad household equality, seen more clearly in some earlier settlements, gives way to a harder structure. Not overnight, and not absolutely, but enough to change the human mood of settlement. In a metropolis, not everyone is close to the center. Some stand in shadow, while others accumulate seals, records, and sacred authority. That darkness belongs in the story too. Civilization is wondrous, but it is rarely innocent. The same systems that make writing possible also make control more exact. The same storage that protects against scarcity can be used to command labor. The same temple that binds community can concentrate power. Uruk is magnificent, but it is also one of the first proofs that complexity and inequality often rise together. The real wonder lies in continuity. When we trace the line from post-glacial adaptation through early cultivation, settled villages, ritual centers, dense proto-urban worlds, Ubaid marsh communities, Eridu temple layers, and finally Uruk administration and writing. The old flood division looks less like history and more like a theological shadow cast across a very long dawn. What the prism preserved as antediluvian mystery and post-flood restoration, the earth preserves as accumulation, layer upon layer, skill upon skill, generation upon generation. No empty world waiting to be restarted. No 6,000-year silence. Only the deep hum of people learning how to bind life into larger forms. If you stand at the end of this chain and look back, it is almost dizzying. The first harvesters cutting wild grain under a hard sky. The builders at Gobekli Tepe raising carved stone circles. The families at Catalhoyuk moving across rooftops above their dead. The canal workers of the Ubaid south shaping water toward fields. The temple attendants at Eridu rebuilding on the same sacred spot. The administrators of Uruk pressing marks into wet clay so memory will finally stop slipping away. All of them belong to one story. And that story is darker, calmer, and more astonishing than the simpler flood reset myth. It says human civilization was not granted in a single dramatic act. It was assembled slowly by tired people who could not see the whole design, only the next repair, the next sewing, the next ritual, the next wall, the next count. They did not know they were making history. They were only trying to endure within the world's climate had left them. Perhaps that is why the old flood myths survived anyway. They gave shape to the fear that all this labor could still be washed away. After all, when you have spent thousands of years learning how to hold order together, water remains the one enemy that can make every boundary disappear in a night. The myth remembers the fear. Archaeology remembers the work. And the speed of the change, which looks so abrupt from a great distance, becomes easier to understand once you stop imagining it as a miracle and start imagining it as ignition. The fuel had been gathering for millennia. Surplus. Ritual centrality. Irrigation knowledge. House-based memory. Exchange networks. Skilled craft. Demographic pressure. Once enough of those lay close together, the threshold could be crossed very quickly in archaeological terms. Even if quickly still meant several human generations watching the horizon fill with more walls than their grandparents ever expected. As this part settles, keep one image close. A tablet in Uruk, still damp, bearing one of the first administrative notations. Nearby, outside the room, a canal glints under late light. Beyond it, fields. Beyond them, older fields. Beyond them, marshes. Beyond them, centuries of forgotten effort. The mark on the clay looks new. The civilization behind it is ancient already. And once writing arrives, the ancient world finally gains the power to describe itself. Though even then, as the prism proves, it will still prefer myth, when myth says the scale better than fact ever could. By the time Uruk learns to write, something subtle but irreversible has happened. Human beings are no longer only surviving within a landscape. They are managing one, measuring it, segmenting it, turning seasons, lavur, and belief into systems that can outlast a single lifetime. That is the real turning point. I think, not the first wall, not the first seal, not even the first city in isolation, but the moment when memory itself becomes institutional. Once that happens, the world grows heavier, more durable, and in some ways more frightening. The source script kept returning to this truth through many different doors, and now they all begin to close around the same central chamber. Metallurgy, astronomy, irrigation, social hierarchy, standardized measures, long-distance trade, craft specialization, law, ritual architecture. None of these things appear as if dropped whole from the sky. They thicken through time. They borrow from older habits. They become possible because countless unnamed people had already spent millennia learning the discipline of repetition. Take metallurgy first. The old fantasy version of the past likes to imagine metal arriving like magic. A shining substance suddenly mastered by beings more advanced than the fumbling humans around them. The real story is slower, and because it is slower, it feels more intimate. Native copper is noticed, hammered, shaped, heated. Someone discovers that heat changes workability. Someone else notices that certain ores behave differently in fire. Furnaces improve, not because a god hands down a diagram, but because many failures make the walls smarter. Airflow is adjusted. Linings are changed. Temperatures rise. Arsenical copper and then bronze emerge from long practical conversations with stone, flame, and patience. Imagine the workshop in late dusk. Clay furnace, wall breathing heat. Charcoal smell thick in the chest. A worker crouched close enough to know the exact shade that means too hot and the slightly duller one that means not enough yet. Bellows moving with stubborn rhythm. Sweat gathering at the brow and drying almost as fast in the breath of the fire. A small glowing mass tipped from crucible to mold. The shape is still crude by later standards, but the knowledge behind it is already immense. Metallurgy does not need a miracle. It only needs enough generations willing to ruin material until material finally begins to answer. Astronomy belongs to the same kind of patience. The sky does not reveal itself to the hurried. It rewards return. A person marks where Venus rises one season. Another marks it again, years later. A temple attendant notes when the moon appears wrong for the expected month. A farmer cares because irrigation and sowing care. A priest cares because ritual timing cares. Over generations, observation becomes tradition, and tradition becomes system. The heavens grow legible not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of nights. There is something wonderfully humbling in that. We speak of ancient astronomy as though it were abstract thought detached from ordinary life. But much of it begins in the same place as everything else. Necessity. Know when the river may behave. Know when planting is wise. Know when the sacred calendar must turn. Know when the god must be honored. Know when it is safe to promise labor to a project that depends on season. The stars are not ornaments above the city. They are the slow exterior clock by which the city learns to regulate itself. The source transcript was right to insist that such knowledge appears with startling sophistication in the earliest written periods. Sexagesimal systems. Astral regularity. Timekeeping powerful enough to support both ritual and administration. Yet this too need not imply an impossible leap. Once human communities are dense enough, long-lived enough, and disciplined enough, the sky becomes a recordable asset. A city with temples, scribes, and repeated annual obligations is exactly the kind of place where astronomy can stop being scattered folk memory and begin hardening into tradition. And then there is irrigation, perhaps the least glamorous and most decisive achievement of all. Honestly, nothing in the story of Mesopotamia is more quietly impressive. To live in southern Mesopotamia is to accept that water is both benefactor and saboteur. Too little and fields fail. Too much and settlements drown. Too early is wrong. Too late is wrong. Channels clog. Banks collapse. Silt betrays intention. Every canal is a promise that must be renewed constantly, or it becomes a ditch leading nowhere. This is why irrigation is never just technique. It is social discipline made visible on land. A canal has to be cleared by many hands. A bank has to be maintained when it is inconvenient to do so. Water distribution requires scheduling, authority, negotiation, memory, and force when negotiation fails. Once fields depend on shared water control, individuality narrows. You may privately resent your neighbor, but if the embankment breaks because nobody turned up, resentment and hunger begin eating from the same bowl. That is where hierarchy deepens. Not because hierarchy is morally inevitable, but because systems of this scale generate nodes of command. Someone supervises. Someone allocates. Someone records. Someone claims divine sanction for the arrangement. That last point is crucial. In Mesopotamia, authority rarely stands naked for long. It clothes itself in sacred legitimacy. The canal works because order holds. Order holds because the gods remain properly served. The temple stores grain, counts labor, and mediates cosmic favor. Practical management and religious meaning become inseparable. The old flood myths make more sense in that light. The true terror of flood is not only death, it is administrative collapse. Fields erased, boundaries blurred, storage ruined, labor scattered, sacred order humiliated by water. If you have built a civilization around measured flow, catastrophic, unmeasured flow becomes the perfect image of the end of the world. No wonder the flood sits where it does in Mesopotamian memory. It threatens every line the city has drawn against chaos. Social stratification intensifies under these same pressures. The source material emphasized this, and it deserves to remain central. Large houses and small houses, better goods and rough goods, central access and peripheral dependence, administrators, craft specialists, laborers, herders, transport workers, temple servants. The city magnifies differences because the city magnifies dependence. Once a society reaches a certain scale, inequality becomes easier to preserve, harder to hide, and more durable in material form. Still, we should resist telling this as a purely bleak story. Complexity is costly, yes, but it is also generative. A specialist potter can refine form because others feed him. A trained seal cutter can create exquisite miniature worlds because the city needs marks of trust. A scribe can preserve numbers and later stories because someone built the institutional environment in which writing matters. Civilizations make beauty out of discipline just as often as they make domination out of it. Usually, they do both at once. Weights and measures belong here too. A standardized world is a profound psychological achievement. It means a jar in one district can be trusted against a jar elsewhere. It means barley can be reckoned, labor can be compensated, and exchange can move beyond face-to-face intuition. A stone weight seems so simple when recovered from a trench, but it is actually one of the purest symbols of abstraction entering daily life. The world no longer consists only of this basket, this herd, this field. It can now be compared, translated, balanced, and generalized. That is a civilizational leap of the highest order, even if it sits in the palm like an ordinary stone. Law, or at least the deep preconditions for law, grows from the same soil. Before any grand code is carved for public awe, there must already exist shared assumptions about debt, obligation, boundary, compensation, authority, and offense. Those assumptions are older than inscription. They live first in custom, decision, and memory. Only later does a ruler or institution gather them, elevate them, and claim divine endorsement for what had long been practiced in more diffuse form. Again, the pattern repeats. What looks sudden in the written record has usually been ripening in silence for ages. This brings us back to the source script's central argument with painful clarity. The 6,000 years before Sumer were not empty because no writing describes them in detail. They were full precisely because writing had not yet arrived to simplify them into headline events. The Neolithic and Chalcolithic worlds were dense with transformation. Seeds were selected. Herds were managed. Ancestors were placed under floors. Stone circles were raised. Temples were rebuilt on the same sacred ground. Canals were coaxed into usefulness. Pottery styles spread. Trade routes widened. Accounting habits formed. The city, when it finally appeared in written light, was already ancient in embryo. Sometimes, I think the old Sumerian floodline preserved this truth more honestly than it first appears to. The flood swept over. Yes. But perhaps what it really preserved was not a precise hydrological event at the start of civilization. Perhaps it preserved the feeling of deep discontinuity between the visible urban present and the shadow world before it. A way of saying, there was an age before ours, and it was vast, strange, and half submerged. In that sense, the myth is wrong in detail and right in mood. If you stand again before the prism in Oxford after walking through all this evidence, the object changes. The impossible kings no longer look like failed history. They look like compressed, deep time. The floodline no longer reads simply as false chronology. It reads as a sacred hinge, the place where memory folded many difficult millennia into one dark gesture. And the post-flood kingship that follows no longer marks the birth of civilization. It marks the moment civilization became legible to itself. That is the part I find most moving. Human beings had already been doing the work for ages. Then, with writing, with administration, with cities like Uruk and later Sumerian states, they finally gained the means to narrate their own complexity. And of course, when they narrated it, they used myth. Because myth can carry emotional scale better than ledgers can. Ledgers count grain. Myths count eras. So the real answer to the title question begins to settle now. What happened in the 6,000 years before Sumer appeared? Everything that made Sumer possible. Not one vanished empire. Not one total flood reset. Not a clean blank. What happened was the long education of humanity by climate, labor, ritual, memory, water, and time. People learned how to stay, then how to store, then how to measure, then how to command, then how to remember in clay. When the first written cities look back, they see only the outline of that education and call it the world before the flood. Perhaps that is the most haunting thing of all. The real builders of civilization do not usually leave their names. They leave sickle gloss on flint, ash in old hearths, plastered skulls, irrigation cuts, mass-produced bowls, early seals, temple foundations, and finally a city that thinks it invented itself. History is full of that kind of amnesia. The finished structure often forgets the hands that poured its footings, and yet the ground remembers. The ground beneath Eridu, beneath Uruk, beneath villages, shrines, workshops, and canals. Layer after layer. No long silence. Only accumulation. If the prism remembers catastrophe, the soil remembers continuity. And the truth of the ancient world lives, as it so often does, in the space where those two memories meet. By the end of this journey, the flood has become quieter, and that seems right. Not less important. Only quieter. It began the night like a curtain, heavy and final, the line in the King List that seemed to divide deep antiquity from everything recognizably human. Now it feels more like a shadow thrown backward by later civilizations trying to comprehend the enormous labor that preceded them. The waters remain. The fear remains. The sacred hinge remains. But the ground below the story has filled with people. That, I think, is the real revelation. Once you stop asking what single catastrophe erased the missing age, you begin to see the missing age everywhere. It is in the worn teeth of early grain eaters, in the polished edge of a sickle, in a goat pen, in a plaster floor renewed over and over until it becomes memory made tactile, in a temple at Eridu rebuilt upon older temples as though the earth itself could hold devotion in layers, in a canal whose gradient had to be judged by eye and experience long before any king claimed to rule by divine mandate, in a clay tablet from Uruk where marks first begin to stand in for things, because the world has grown too dense from memory alone. The source transcript closed by arguing that the so-called missing 6,000 years were never silent. They were the most important years of all. That is exactly right. Silence is only what later writing mistakes for absence. Archaeology knows better. Archaeology has a different temperament. It does not care whether a civilization named itself the first. It asks instead what lies under the floor, under the wall, under the shrine, under the flood layer, under the city that thinks history began when it learned to speak its own name. And what lies there is almost always another attempt, another adaptation, another compromise with land and weather. The old biblical chronologies, the neat counting backward from kings to patriarchs to a world only a few thousand years old, belong to a powerful tradition of meaning-making. So do the Sumerian kings with their impossible reigns. Both systems take the terrifying depth of human and natural time and fold it into forms the mind can hold. One chooses genealogical compression. The other chooses gigantic rains and a flood-divided world. Both are elegant in their way. Neither is what the ground says. What the ground says is harder, and to me, more beautiful. It says human beings were remaking themselves for millennia after the ice began to loosen its hold. It says the first villages were not failures because they were not yet cities. It says ritual preceded states. It says dense symbolic life preceded writing. It says people buried their dead beneath their floors, watched the stars for seasons, managed water before they could describe hydraulics, and learned administration before they could write administration down. It says civilization was not delivered. It was assembled. I have always found that word satisfying. Assembled. It implies parts gathered under pressure. Not born whole. Not granted fully finished. Put together, adjusted, repaired, and often held together with more hope than certainty. That sounds like the ancient world. Honestly, it sounds like every world. Now, when I picture the Weld Blundell Prism, I no longer see it as the beginning of the story. I see it as a late act of compression, a Mesopotamian mind looking backward across a depth almost too great to narrate, and choosing the only scale that feels adequate. If the kings before the flood are impossibly long-lived, perhaps it is because the age before cities felt immeasurable. If the flood divides everything, perhaps it is because no ordinary transition could capture how different the deep past seemed from the ordered urban present. Myth, in that sense, is not the enemy of truth. It is what happens when truth is too vast for simple chronology. The antediluvian kings become symbolic custodians of the unknowable age before writing. The flood becomes the hinge between remembered sacred past and documentable civic order. Kingship descending from heaven becomes a way of saying that social order did not feel invented by ordinary people, because by the time cities were mature enough to reflect on themselves, the roots of order had already vanished beyond living memory. That is why the phrase, "the flood swept over," still works, even now. Not as geology, not as strict chronology, but as atmosphere. A whole world of patient becoming lay behind the first written cities, and by the time scribes pressed signs into clay, that earlier world could only be felt as distance, loss, and half-drowned grandeur. Let yourself imagine that distance for a minute. 6,000 years. Longer than the distance between us and the first pyramids. Longer than the age of classical Greece, Rome, the medieval world, the Renaissance, and the Industrial Age combined. A span so large that entire styles of being human rise and fall inside it without leaving names. In that long night, people learned to plant, to keep animals, to build shrines, to bury their dead in place, to organize labor, to stabilize villages, to widen exchange, to observe the sky, to harden metal, to control water, and eventually to create cities. Then, at last, they wrote. No wonder the first written civilizations looked backward in awe. Perhaps that is also why so many later traditions, not only Mesopotamian but biblical and others, keep returning to floods, lost ages, primeval kings, and divine instruction. The deep past always feels both ancestral and inaccessible. It belongs to us and escapes us. That tension breeds myth naturally. Human beings do not like admitting that their foundations were built by countless forgotten people whose names are gone. So we imagine patriarchs, sages, giant rains, descending order, and one great catastrophe to explain why the earliest world seems both close and unreachable. But archaeology, patient and almost tender in its stubbornness, gives the forgotten back some dignity. It cannot restore their names, most of the time. It cannot give us their voices whole, but it can show that they existed in abundance, that they worked, failed, adapted, remembered, and handed forward more than later civilizations realized. Every trench through an early mound is a correction to arrogance. Every older temple level under Eridu, every settlement horizon below the grander architecture, every pre-urban site with unexpected complexity. All of them say the same thing. You came later than you think. That feels like the true moral of the story, if a sleep story may be allowed a moral at all. The world before Sumer was not primitive emptiness. It was humanity in apprenticeship, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes painfully, learning what it would cost to make permanence. The first cities did not spring from void. They crystallized from a very old human struggle with environment, memory, and each other. The so-called missing years are where the real drama lies, because they contain the slow invention of nearly everything cities would later claim as their own. There is humor in that, too. The great kings come along with seals, titles, walls, and official confidence, and beneath them lies the long-buried labor of anonymous farmers arguing about irrigation, builders replastering walls, ritual specialists tending fires, potters repeating forms until they become standard, and people everywhere trying to keep grain dry. Grand civilization rests on very humble obsessions. Still, humble does not mean small. The longer I sit with the evidence, the more astonishing those obsessions become. A seed saved rather than eaten. A channel maintained one more season. A burial beneath the house that says we belong here. A carved pillar raised for gatherings before farming fully settles. A painted bowl style spreading across regions. A temple rebuilt on the same spot because someone believes the place still matters. Each act alone is slight. Together, they become the oldest and most durable architecture of all. Continuity. And continuity. More than flood. is what the archaeological record teaches. Not uninterrupted ease, not a smooth upward line. There were collapses, shifts, drownings, abandonnement, resettlements, bad seasons, and local disasters enough. But through them all, something continued. Knowledge, practice, orientation, the will to make order again after disorder. In that sense, even the flood myths preserve a fragment of the deeper archaeological truth. Human beings repeatedly faced disruption and repeatedly rebuilt. The myths made one grand story out of many smaller survivals. So now we return one last time to the museum case. The prism waits in stillness. The wedge-shaped signs remain crisp under the light. Visitors pass. Pause. Read. Move on. Perhaps most of them glance only briefly. But if you linger, if you let the object expand in the imagination, it becomes much larger than its clay dimensions. It becomes a late window looking backward across thousands of unwritten years. It becomes a voice of a city trying to place itself in sacred time. It becomes, strangely enough, a memorial to the people it failed to name. And if you listen even more closely, beyond the kings and flood, beyond the numbers, beyond the theological architecture, you may hear something almost gentle, not a single revelation, not a lost empire suddenly exposed, but the long murmur of human effort. Grinding stone, reed hut in wind, water at the canal bank, hammer on copper, bellows breathing, stylus in clay, one age passing its difficult knowledge to the next, whether or not it remembered every hand involved. That is what really happened in the 6,000 years before Sumer appeared. Humanity learned how to become difficult enough, cooperative enough, patient enough, frightened enough, imaginative enough, and organized enough to make cities. It learned in cold phases and warm phases, in floodplains and uplands, in shrines and workshops, in villages and proto-towns, through rituals and failures and practical chores that never expected an audience. The old myths looked back and saw a drowned world before history. The earth looks back and sees an education. And perhaps that is the calmer ending. We do not need a vanished super-civilization or a single cataclysmic reset to make the past worthy of wonder. The real past is already more than enough. It holds immense climate swings, drowned coastlines, sacred experiments, buried temples, forgotten generations, and finally, the first cities pressing signs into clay because memory had grown too large to carry in the body alone. That is not a lesser story. It is the deeper one. The flood swept over, the prism says. Yes. In myth, yes. In feeling, yes. But beneath that line, beneath that solemn compression, the ground keeps speaking. It says people were there long before the kings named themselves. It says they built the foundations in silence. It says civilization was not born in a single morning, but gathered slowly like water filling a canal, until one day the current was strong enough to carry writing, law, kingship, and all the rest. When we finally hear that, the old contradiction between myth and archaeology softens. The myth keeps the awe. The archaeology gives us the work. and together they tell us that the lost millennia were never lost at all. They were only waiting for us to learn how to read them. The fire has burned low now. The museum is closing in the mind. The trench walls darken. The prism remains under its glass, still carrying its old impossible kings into another night. And somewhere far below it, under layers of soil, ash, brick, and flood silt, the unnamed builders of the first settled world remain where they have always been, patient, foundational, and finally a little less forgotten. Good night,